He laughed at me in front of everyone. The laughter landed like a weight on my chest, and for a second, the room felt louder than it had any right to be. The glass slipped against my palm and left a wet ring on the mahogany table as if it wanted to mark the moment for posterity. They thought they had shown me my place. They did not know I had been building the map back to power in the dark for years. They applauded the joke and called it natural theater. I let them. The restaurant smelled of lemon oil and old money. The chandelier shivered every time someone stood, and the metallic tang of the wine mixed with the hum of conversation to make a kind of armor around their confidence. I heard the echo of plates, the scrape of a chair, the casual click of a cufflink. I smiled, not because I was amused, but because patience can look like amusement. Tomorrow would not be the same. Tomorrow, a board meeting would begin with a different name on the agenda. I had kept a list of small humiliations in a file labeled simply Notes. Those notes were precise. The note that night read, "Remember this laugh." It felt petty to write it down then. Later, it would be evidence. My name was Alex. I had not been born to privilege, and I had not been spared humiliation. I had been underestimated by teachers, dismissed by classmates, and used as a foil in conversations meant to make other people feel larger. I had learned early how to be patient and how to translate humiliation into fuel. The company we were then a part of began as a modest software team I had helped assemble. I had negotiated the first vendor contracts, coded the first reliable process for billing, convinced the first skeptical investor to wire money. I worked nights and weekends, not for glory, but because the work itself was the only honest judge I trusted. I saved every contract, every draft, every email that hinted at intent. I kept a separate set of books in my head and in a secure drive, a ledger of promises people made and then erased. I had a reason to be meticulous. My father had run a small printing shop and had been bankrupted overnight by an opaque transfer labeled as a fee. He explained loss as a lesson in the currency of trust. That lesson kept me awake when others slept. He taught me how to read a ledger the way other people read a map. He taught me to trust procedures more than people and to watch return addresses and signatures. I promised him, quietly, that if I ever had a seat at a table, I would never let the ledger be invisible again. I built and guarded assets through a holding I kept off the public record. I registered shell entities, then consolidated them under a parent holding. That looked innocuous on paper because it should look innocuous. I learned to make legal complexity my ally. I learned to dress like I belonged where I wanted to belong and to speak less than I planned. Most critical, I learned to recruit people who were good at opposite things from me. That is how I found Sarah. Sarah was not just a friend. She was the person who turned intuition into documentation. Quiet, methodical, precise, she transcribed conversations without making anyone uncomfortable. She could sit 3 seats away from someone and make them reveal a term they had not intended to reveal. She had been my accounting director for 5 years, and more importantly, she was the person I trusted to translate moral certainty into admissible evidence. I learned to rely on her notes as if they were appendices to my memory. When I say I planned for years, I mean years. I had a list of contingencies and backups and a thought process for when any one of them failed. Strategy was not theatrical for me. It was arithmetic. I counted exposures the way others counted applause. My goal was not to humiliate them in front of dinner plates. My goal was to make a structure that would not tolerate the kind of arrogance they wore like cologne. I wanted to create an institution so robust in process that future humiliation of the vulnerable would be impossible, or at least much costlier. The payoff would not be only personal, it would be systemic. The man who played the antagonist was named Daniel Pierce. He had started as charismatic and incremental, a product of confidence and an ability to speak in absolutes. He had charm like a currency, and he spent it freely. He was raised in privilege and believed that privilege was evidence of entitlement rather than responsibility. He had a laugh that filled rooms and a habit of reducing people to simple roles so that his decisions would not be complicated by empathy. He loved to make decisions quickly and to make spectacle of them, just to demonstrate control. Daniel was a lawyer by training and a strategist by temperament. He could write a clause that sounded reasonable and then watch that clause be enforced in ways that protected his circle and punished anyone else. He cultivated advisors in the right places and believed legal opacity was an art form. He often said that complexity was the best camouflage. He had been central to converting our small company into a profitable entity while simultaneously rearranging profit channels so his closest allies took a disproportionate share. He gave the press sound bites and the board assurances. He called moral questions a distraction and treated procedures as tools to be bent rather than to be strengthened. Over the years, I began to see patterns where others saw coincidences. Small transfers to vendors with names that matched children's initials, contracts awarded without bids, NDAs that were used not to protect trade secrets, but to silence people who noticed anomalies. Daniel knew how to make these things look like business. He also liked to make mockery an instrument. He would single someone out at the end of a meeting, ask them to explain a missed target in a tone that invited shame, and then post about it later in a private channel with a laughing emoji so his inner circle could enjoy the performance. I did not hate him because he was successful. I prepared to remove him because he weaponized structural weakness and because excuses had been exhausted. The choice to act was procedural as much as personal. After the laughter that night, I went home and reviewed the recordings Sarah had been collecting. We had a secure office on the edge of the city, a room I used like a submarine. It was small, windowless, with a single lamp that hummed, a safe bolted to the floor, and a server rack with drives that never connected to the company network. The smell there was always of paper and metal and coffee. I had installed acoustic insulation, so even loud voices from outside sounded like whispers inside. I sat with Sarah, and we laid out the map of what would need to change. We talked through every angle. We needed admissible evidence, not hearsay. We needed a narrative that would hold up publicly and procedurally. We needed secure transfer protocols and a PR story that could not be spun into a counterattack. Sarah put her hand on a stack of encrypted drives and pushed them toward me. She had a look that meant she had already tested emotional reactions until they were predictable. The plan had levels. We would gather transaction records and match them to board minutes. We would pull correspondence and trace emails to private accounts. We would also need whistleblowers willing to testify with protection. I remember that night her voice was steady. She said, "We can do this without theatrics." I said, "Theater will come when it is necessary. Until then, we keep collecting. Until then, we make sure nothing is ambiguous." We listed names of people reliable enough to stand as witnesses, people whose careers had been derailed by decisions they could now document. We cataloged photographs, receipts, calendar invites. We had conversations recorded with consent where possible and with legal clearance where necessary. We built a timeline so precise that it would read like a chain rather than a story. I asked her to check the internal expense systems and to look for recurring descriptions that failed to match deliverables. She nodded and opened her laptop. "I have found 3 sets of entries that match patterns you described," she said. "They circle back to 2 shell companies that pay for services that never happened. One is registered under a name that belongs to Daniel's brother-in-law." She tapped keys and a spreadsheet bloomed on the screen. Every number had a footprint. We named allies who would be crucial. There was Mark, a senior engineer who had access to older commit logs and who could show when features were stripped from products in ways that favored outside contractors. There was Jennifer, formerly HR, who had a folder of exit interviews that contained pointed phrases about the culture Daniel spread. There was Omar, the compliance officer, who had once tried to raise a flag and was sidelined. There was Alina, a junior analyst who had accidentally saved an email to the wrong folder and had kept it. There was Michael, a board member who had always been cautious and who we hoped to persuade that the structure was unsound. Each person had a role and a set of protections offered in return for cooperation. We staffed the operation as if it were a startup. Sarah managed evidence, Mark handled technical validations, Jennifer prepared victim statements, Omar reviewed procedural compliance, Alina pulled the emails. I coordinated outreach to a trusted external counsel who specialized in corporate governance. We rehearsed what to do if Daniel tried to block any move with a claim of confidentiality or threatened litigation. The rehearsal felt clinical and precise. We practiced statements and responses until the sound of them felt like practice for truth. We realigned my public persona to fit a new script. I would be seen as available, too available. I would play the role of underdog because it made my steps surprising. A month later, I accepted an invitation to sit in what they called an informal interview with a panel that included 2 board members and 3 senior executives. I walked into that room with a coat that smelled faintly of rain and a pocket full of notes that were meant to be disposable. The room smelt of lemon oil again, but there was an edge of printer toner and dust. The panel had coffee rings and sharp notepads. They liked to see a persona like mine. They smiled in the comforting way of people who have already judged you. The panel began with small talk. Daniel was not present. I sat across from Michael and across from an HR executive named Leela, who had a habit of speaking too softly. The questions were polite. They asked about my plans and my availability. I answered, and they nodded, like actors practicing synchrony. I made small, deliberate errors in my resume story. I suggested a timeline that was marginally misaligned with recorded events. I allowed them to frame me as inexperienced in governments so that their later contempt would be louder. It was bait. They took it. "Why did you leave your last role?" Michael asked. I wanted space to think about product integrity, I said. I needed to step back from day to day and understand the mechanics behind our decisions. "And by mechanics, you mean what exactly?" Leela asked, pen poised. "How we track obligation," I said. "How promises become invoices and how invoices become explanations. It is all in the ledger." A few heads tilted. There were moments of microaggression. One panelist, Thomas, chuckled and said, "We are not looking for philosophers." Daniel had trained his people to dismiss nuance. My errors gave them license to condescend. Each chuckle was recorded in my mind, cataloged and assigned a weight. I noticed the way Thomas tapped his watch. I noticed the scent of his cologne, too sharp to be accidental. Sarah sat in the front row of the audience and recorded. She caught every tilt of an eyebrow. After the official questions, there was an exchange with a junior employee named Kevin who had been late on a deliverable. Daniel liked to make examples of one person to correct a group. "We need people who can deliver," he said in a tweaked tone. I played into it. I said, "I have been late before. I learned to fix the reasons why. The team needs structures to support delivery and not a whip." The laughter that followed was small, but it had teeth. That interview gave us what we needed. It gave us repeated instances of language that proved a culture of contempt. It gave us naming conventions and patterns of dismissal. It gave us recordable exchanges where arrogance was normalized. That night, Sarah extracted audio and transcribed every mockery. The pattern was undeniable when stacked in sequence. After we had the evidence and witnesses secured, we staged a different entry. We did not announce our move. We prepared formal governance motions and legal filings to bring to the board. We prepared the paperwork that would allow me to be considered for a role with the authority to review transactions and to suspend accounts. We filed an internal petition citing governance failures and calling for an external audit. We did this with the kind of procedural language that appealed to law and to reputation. My entrance into the company as an acting executive was not cinematic in the way movies show. It was a stream of escalations and notices. It happened with a notice of temporary authority granted for oversight pending audit. I walked into the boardroom on the day of the hearing wearing a coat that fit like armor. The corridor felt colder than I remembered. The carpet muffled footsteps. The air was still at the top of the stairs. People turned their heads and the room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the hum of the building. The effect landed, as we had calculated. I stood and addressed the board. I began by acknowledging the humiliations people carried, including my own. I delivered the sequence we had prepared. Sarah set the screen. The first slide appeared, and it was not a dramatic image, but a ledger. Numbers unspooled across the screen, matched to dates and to named individuals. There was a click, and a document appeared, underlined by a transfer to a vendor with a name that matched familial initials. I narrated each. I watched faces. Daniel did not move much, but I could see his jaw. "These are only the highlights," I said. "There are threads that connect them into a coherent fabric of preference and misallocation." "On what basis are you connecting those items?" Daniel asked. His voice was controlled. "On the basis of contract deliverables and actual deliveries," I said. "On invoices and on system logs. On calendar invites and on receipts. On emails we can verify. On witnesses who will testify under oath." Voices rose. There were questions and denials. Daniel called it a smear. He accused me of overreach and of trying to unsettle investors. The boardroom was full of people used to being convinced by the small tricks of persuasive men. I let them speak. I let them try to discredit me. They were predictable in the ways they attacked motive and in the way they tried to make it personal. We had prepared for this. The legal counsel we had retained walked through a procedurally tidy presentation. We submitted a formal request for an independent forensic audit. We presented a timeline of transfers and the names of the shell companies. We tied each shell company to a person. We had witnesses ready to confirm the motions and receipts. We had electronic logs cross-referenced with commit times and code changes. We had bank statements that matched the months when features had been removed from products. "Do you see that the vendor never provided deliverables?" I asked the room. "These are allegations," said Daniel. "We will examine them." "We are not asking you to take our word for anything," I said. "We are asking you to authorize a third party to examine the ledgers and to make findings. If the findings clear these allegations, then we will own that outcome publicly. If they do not, then the timing is clear about who benefited." That line landed in a way we had rehearsed. Twice Daniel tried to interrupt, and twice the chair asked him to wait. The chair was an old hand named Evelyn who had spent most of her career mitigating risk. She had never liked spectacle. She asked for the audit. When the motion passed, there were looks between board members like weather changing. Daniel understood he had been boxed in. After the motion passed, we moved quickly. We locked access to certain accounts pending audit, and we suspended authorization for transfers to the shell entities. We put a temporary freeze on vendor payments that matched our patterns of concern. The IT team, under Mark's direction, placed monitoring on outbound transfers and instituted dual sign-offs where previously only one signature had sufficed. The sound in the control room was the tick of keyboards and the occasional murmur of status checks. The smell was now of burned coffee and the metallic ozone of server rooms. There were logistical problems. People noticed delays. Vendors called. Daniel accused us of destabilizing operations. We responded with a press package prepared by our counsel and a PR firm we had engaged for contingencies. The press package was factual and short. We did not revel in accusation. We announced an independent audit, cooperation with regulatory authorities, and a commitment to transparency. We emphasized protections for employees who came forward. We then triggered the phase we called the storm protocol. This was a careful sequence of controlled disclosures to regulators and, when appropriate, to the market. We filed reports with the relevant market oversight authority detailing suspicious transfers and requesting an expedited review. We opened a dialogue with legal authorities about potential misuse of corporate funds and possible breaches of fiduciary duty. We offered conditional cooperation agreements to some participants in exchange for truthful cooperation. The point was not to manufacture drama, but to create a perimeter that would prevent frantic damage control. The market responds to structure. Chaos begets rumor. We preferred evidence. The forensic audit found irregularities that matched our hypothesis and then some. It took 2 weeks of thorough work. The auditors described a pattern of vendor selection that lacked credible procurement documents. They noted invoice sequences that bore similarities to known schemes where insiders misdirect funds. They indicated that internal controls had been deliberately relaxed in certain windows to allow transfers to clear. The report was technical but legible. It spelled out transactions, dates, amounts, and signatures. It also included an annex with redacted email trails that showed instructions consistent with influencing procurement. At that point, the pressure on Daniel mounted. Investors demanded answers. Some of the employees he had mocked earlier came forward with testimony. Jennifer, the HR source, submitted a dossier of exit interviews that corroborated a culture of dismissal. Omar shared compliance memos that Daniel had overridden. Elena provided an email that had been saved to the wrong folder and that attached a spreadsheet linking vendors to personal accounts. We deployed an operational team to secure corporate assets. We changed passwords, reset keycards, and placed additional oversight on wire transfers. We issued a public statement that we were cooperating fully with regulators and that an interim management plan had been put in place to ensure continuity. We arranged for legal counsel to be present in all operational meetings and to ensure that any attempt to move funds would be blocked by multiple sign-offs. We coordinated with our bank to put alerts on suspicious transfers and to require manual reviews. The legal process was designed to be airtight. We filed for a temporary injunction to prevent destruction of records and to stop transfers to identified accounts. We submitted the forensic audit to the regulators and requested expedited review. We offered witness protection where necessary, and we negotiated a process for interviews with our counsel present. Our goal was not to humiliate in a courtroom, but to create a process where truth could be extracted without games. The injunction froze certain activities and granted the auditor access to archives. In a procedural sense, this was a surgical intervention to preserve the evidence chain. As the regulators opened an investigation, the market reacted. The company's stock slipped while rumors of governance issues circulated. Daniel tried to spin it as a governance dispute, a power play. Investors were skeptical. Analysts asked hard questions about internal controls and about how much oversight the board had provided. We had prepared materials that mapped the controls and the failures so that when questions arose, we had a clean answer. The company offered immediate cooperation and appointed an interim committee to oversee remediation. Under the pressure of audit and regulatory inquiry, some of Daniel's supporters distanced themselves. There were resignations, abrupt and awkward. A few executives took settlements and left quietly. Daniel launched a counterattack through his allies, alleging that the audit was politically motivated. We had anticipated that tactic. We published the unredacted findings with minimal commentary and allowed the facts to speak. The clarity made spinners struggle. There was a day I will not forget. I walked down the main corridor and felt the silence that follows a storm. People looked up. The glass of the windows reflected faces like a collage of shock and relief. The board had convened an emergency session, and the motion for Daniel's termination was set. The vote hinged on 2 undecided members. I sat with Michael, who had been thoughtful, and with Evelyn, who had favored caution. They voted to remove Daniel for gross mismanagement and for breach of fiduciary duty. In one motion, the man who had made a spectacle of others was asked to leave. He protested. He called it a coup. He accused me of arrogance. "Did you expect me to be surprised?" I asked him in the room. "You played a part in this," he said. "I played a part in telling the truth," I said. "That is the difference." There were words exchanged between board members and Daniel that could become evidence of motive later. Daniel demanded a formal hearing and threatened litigation. He sent a cascade of lawyers and PR statements. We responded with procedural calm and with a readiness to litigate if necessary, but also with a willingness to settle for remediation that fixed processes and compensated victims. The message we sent publicly was that the company would rebuild and that the culture that permitted mockery and improper transfers would be corrected. We then focused on repair. We instituted new procurement protocols requiring multiple independent approvals for vendor selection. We published a public code of conduct that specifically addressed workplace mockery and power abuses. We established a compensation fund for employees who had been affected by past decisions and who could demonstrate harm. We created a new whistleblower program with anonymity guarantees and direct channels to external auditors. These were not cosmetic moves. We set metrics for compliance and scheduled audits. The market responded as markets do. There was volatility, then a slow recalibration. Many people applauded the transparency and the reform. Others said we had acted too quickly. Lawsuits followed. Some settled, some went to court. The regulators imposed fines and compliance requirements that reshaped the governance. Investors asked for a new leadership cadence, and we provided it. We hired a new CEO who had a reputation for strengthening controls and for rebuilding culture. He was a woman named Priya who had spent a career in operations and who believed that empathy was a structural advantage. She understood that preventing abuse required process and human commitment. We documented every procedural step we took in exacting detail. The process notes explained how we handled locked accounts, how we preserved the chain of custody for digital evidence, how we arranged witness interviews, and how we ensured that forensic auditors had unimpeded access to archives. Each procedural description mapped to policy changes that would remain. Those notes were 300 characters of clarity and no more. They read like a manual for prevention. The fallout was human as much as legal. Some people were angry that a man lost power. Some were grateful to have a chance to come back. Jennifer returned in a new role to oversee people programs. Mark received recognition and a project budget to build secure systems. Omar was promoted to head compliance. Elena left for graduate school with a fellowship that acknowledged her courage. We created a fund that offered compensation and a fast track for rehiring people who had been unfairly dismissed. 1 month after the events, the company had already taken tangible steps. We had completed the initial remediation plan and had a timeline for implementing stricter controls. Employee surveys showed an immediate uptick in trust metrics. We paid compensation to a group of former employees and created a task force to ensure that procurement had independent oversight. The press covered the story with caution and with interest in the governance implications. Investors were watching, but some had begun to see value in the company that actively corrected its errors. The public narrative had shifted from scandal to reform because we prioritized transparency. 3 months later, the audit results had been published in full. The regulators had levied fines and had recommended a remediation period. The board had adopted a long-term plan to separate oversight from operations. We had instituted mandatory training about workplace dignity and had appointed an independent compliance officer reporting directly to the board. A number of workers who had been marginalized were rehired or promoted, and a formal reconciliation program was in place to handle restitution. The financial impact of the fines was significant but manageable. Morale began to stabilize and new product initiatives were underway, now with clearer controls and more inclusive governance. 6 months on, the company felt like a different organism. It had new leadership, new policies, and a clearer sense of purpose. Priya had launched an initiative to measure decision impacts before they were implemented and to require diverse oversight panels for major procurement moves. Employee retention, the stock had recovered modestly, and analysts noted the long-term promise of a company that had survived a crisis by reinforcing its bones. The city recognized our efforts with a small award for governance reform and an invitation to speak about institutional resilience. For me, the victory was not simply that the man who mocked me was gone. It was that systems were changed so that what he had done could not happen so easily again. There were costs. Daniel contested his dismissal in court. He sent lawyers, and he used media outlets to paint himself as a martyr to corporate politics. Some of his supporters continued to whisper in corners and to question motives. I did not relish the attention. I had not wanted to be a spectacle. I wanted the ledger to be balanced and for the institution to protect its people. Still, having to answer to his counterclaims was draining. In the months that followed, we settled some matters and litigated others. We negotiated agreements that required restitution and the promotion of reforms. We initiated training programs and governance audits at other companies that wanted to learn. We testified in hearings about procurement and about the dangers of conflating personal loyalty with corporate oversight. Our internal policies became case studies in business schools and were referenced in regulatory guidance about internal controls. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Many of you have likely been mocked or belittled, and you know how it feels to have your value reduced by someone else for their own gain. I invited people in the comments to share a time they had been underestimated. I asked them to start with the phrase, "when I was underestimated," so I could read and highlight some stories. The comments mattered because they helped build a community of people who wanted practical change and not just a spectacle. The stories people shared were moving, and they informed the kinds of case studies we published later. In the end, the best revenge was not revenge in the petty sense. It was structural change. It was replacing a culture that tolerated mockery with rules that prevented it. It was reintroducing dignity into the way decisions were made. Some people returned with titles and responsibilities. Some left and found places where their talents were respected. I learned that power without accountability is a machine for harm, and that accountability without cruelty is effective. If this story resonated, consider subscribing for more narratives that blend strategy, law, and human consequences. I plan to publish documents and lessons that can help other organizations identify similar patterns and design prevention. Thank you for watching and for believing that patience can be an instrument of justice. Remember the glass on the table and what it taught us about who was paying attention. The real triumph was not in firing detractors. The real triumph was in making their tools useless.